By the 1890s, the United States, with its expansive territory, immense wealth, and a population of 65 million, was acutely aware of its status as one of the world's foremost powers. Historical evidence suggests that small nations situated on the peripheries of burgeoning empires often face significant threats, a reality that applied to Cuba, located merely 100 miles south of the continental United States. During this period, Cuba remained under the waning control of the Spanish Empire. Yet American interests and cultural influences had begun to assert themselves. When conflict erupted between the United States and Spain, Cuba narrowly escaped, becoming an annex of the United States, albeit at the cost of considerable autonomy. Throughout the 19th century, the destinies of the US and Cuba became increasingly intertwined. Cuba's social elite were educated and mingled in America, while American entities dominated numerous mines, plantations, and ranches on the island. Notably, 87% of Cuba's exports were directed to the United States. The extent of American influence was starkly illustrated in 1894 with the enactment of the Wilson-Gorman Tariff on sugar imports, which devastated the Cuban sugar industry and precipitated an economic and social crisis. This turmoil incited unrest and ultimately led to a rebellion against the Spanish authorities, who proved incapable of addressing the escalating issues. The Cuban rebellion garnered substantial support in the United States, with the Republican platform for the 1896 election explicitly endorsing Cuban independence as a means to diminish European imperial power in the Americas. Additionally, there were significant economic motivations, as many American businessmen had substantial investments in Cuba. The brutal response from the Spanish, particularly under General Valeriano Blair, resulted in the deaths of approximately 100,000 individuals due to violence. The scorched earth policy, while often attributed to the sensationalism of the yellow press that exacerbated tensions, does not fully encapsulate the complexities surrounding the Spanish-American War. The reality was that the United States had already invested significant interests in Cuba, making it difficult to overlook the situation. President William McKinley initially resisted the growing calls for military action. However, as the Cuban rebellion intensified throughout 1897 and American financial interests continued to suffer, he faced mounting pressure to respond. His administration engaged in negotiations with Spain, urging them to implement reforms and grant greater autonomy to the Cuban people. In early February 1898, a leaked letter from the Spanish ambassador in Washington, which ridiculed McKinley and indicated Spain's lack of commitment to reform, incited public outrage. This incident fueled demands for direct intervention, which escalated rapidly. Just a week later, on February 15th, the USS Maine tragically exploded while docked in Havana Harbor, resulting in the loss of 266 American lives. Although historians suggest that the explosion was likely due to internal factors, the prevailing sentiment at the time pointed to Spain as the culprit. The call for war became inescapable as citizens, journalists, and politicians rallied around the slogan "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." On April 11, 1898, McKinley sought congressional approval for military intervention against Spain, as public pressure had reached a critical point. Despite the fact that the Cuban rebels were gaining ground and appeared capable of expelling Spanish forces independently, there were underlying concerns. One theory posits that the United States feared a scenario similar to the Haitian Rebellion, where victorious rebels had violently targeted the white population on the island. The concern that racially mixed Cubans might retaliate against Americans, who wielded significant control over their economy, was not easily dismissed. Additionally, there was a more straightforward rationale. Cuba could potentially be incorporated into the extensive dominion of the United States, with its lucrative plantations representing a substantial economic advantage for some. Conversely, figures such as Senator Henry Teller of Colorado viewed the acquisition of Cuba as a perilous endeavor, fearing that an influx of Cuban sugar would devastate the American sugar market. Beet sugar was a crucial component of Colorado's economy, and this apprehension was shared by many other states, particularly in the South. In response, Teller and his Senate allies sought to prevent any potential Cuban sugar influx by introducing the Teller Amendment, which prohibited any permanent annexation of Cuba by the United States. It is likely that other factors contributed to the support for the Teller Amendment, as the racial and religious composition of Cuba was deemed undesirable by many Americans who opposed having such demographics under their governance. Some genuine sympathy for Cuban independence may have also influenced this stance. Nevertheless, the influence of business interests in securing the inclusion of the Teller Amendment in Congress's joint resolution of April 20th, which declared war on Spain, cannot be overlooked. The Spanish-American War itself was a brief conflict, characterized by relatively low casualties. While the majority of the military engagements occurred in Cuba, the United States also took control of the Philippines and Puerto Rico during this period, with minimal loss of life. The primary fighting took place in Cuba, where the Spanish forces were already weakened from a prolonged rebellion. US troops landed in Santiago in June and had successfully defeated the Spanish by the end of August, although disease also played a significant role in the conflict, a significantly greater cause of mortality than warfare. Yet this did not deter the American ambassador in London from famously referring to it as a splendid little war. The Treaty of Paris in 1898 officially concluded the conflict, bestowing upon the United States control over Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam. In the case of Cuba, the United States established a temporary military government to facilitate its transition from a colony to an independent nation. The Teller Amendment prohibited formal annexation. However, the military government would test the boundaries of this restriction. Initially, General John R. Bourke led the government, focusing on restoring order and disbanding rebel militias. Nevertheless, other figures within the occupying administration, including General Leonard Wood and certain officials in Washington, contended that the United States should maintain its presence. They believed that the Cubans lacked the capability for self-governance, arguing that generations of Spanish colonial rule and perceived racial inferiority rendered them, in the words of one American general, unfit for self-rule, akin to how gunpowder is unsuitable for hell. They advocated for a move toward annexation, irrespective of the Teller Amendment's stipulations. In December 1899, Wood succeeded Bourke as military governor of Cuba, continuing the public works initiatives initiated under Bourke and establishing an American-style education and judicial system, with the aim of transforming Cuba into a more Americanized society. He populated the government with Americanized elites while marginalizing others. Additionally, his administration imposed stringent voting restrictions, allowing only 5% of the population to participate through a combination of literacy, property ownership, and military service requirements. This strategy aimed to silence the voices of ordinary Cubans in favor of pro-American elements who would support annexation. Unsurprisingly, Many Cuban veterans of the rebellion were acutely aware of these maneuvers. Nationalists mobilized in September 1900 to counteract what they perceived as an American conspiracy. Their efforts proved successful as they won the assembly elections, thereby gaining control of the legislature and undermining US aspirations for outright annexation. In response, the nationalists promptly began formulating a framework for an independent Cuba, clearly stating their refusal to accept a perpetual military government. They asserted that if the Americans sought to occupy the island, they would have to confront the Cuban people. The McKinley administration, however, was not inclined to engage in such a conflict. Recognizing the multitude of American interests in Cuba, the US opted to maintain its influence rather than abandon it entirely. Consequently, the Americans leveraged the threat of continued occupation to force Cuba into accepting several humiliating concessions. While the US promised a peaceful withdrawal, it reserved the right to intervene in Cuban affairs as deemed necessary, prohibited Cuba from forming alliances without US approval, and retained control over Guantanamo Bay. These stipulations were articulated in the Platt Amendment, which was attached to a 1901 Army Appropriations Bill. The terms represented a flagrant infringement on Cuban sovereignty and, coupled with America's economic dominance, effectively rendered Cuba an imperial dependency, despite its nominal independence. This situation was viewed as an affront, yet the cost of refusal was deemed too steep for a nation already ravaged by war. As one Cuban nationalist remarked, it was a choice between annexation or a republic with an amendment. Ultimately, Cuba reluctantly accepted the Platt Amendment as an addition to its new constitution in 1902. The US occupation officially concluded on May 20, 1902. But American dominance over the island remained firmly established. Cuba, despite the circumstances, enjoyed significant economic and political advantages from control with minimal associated costs. This situation exemplified a masterclass in imperial strategy. However, the Teller Amendment and the political opposition from Cuban nationalists prevented Cuba from experiencing a fate similar to that of Guam or Puerto Rico, which continued to be US territories. As a result, with the exception of Guantanamo Bay, Cuba has maintained its status as an independent nation ever since.